Okay. And okay, I think we have a recording going. Basically, what you see under free will and fatalism, I covered that Monday in such detail. I'm not even going to worry about it today. When I went over the question having to do with Oedipus and his fate, and so I'm going to begin with determinism and how does it relate to past to the future? Well, basically, it says that a unique causal past determines a unique future. In other words, it holds that the physical structure and the laws of the universe are such that if we know what the causal past is, we can guarantee what's going to happen in the future because nature is that rigid. And so now this is a more or less scientific discussion of free will, determinism. In other words, it holds that either environment or heredity or especially, the laws of the universe and, the atomic structure of the universe are what determines our choices. Pretty much most of these types of either soft or hard determinists are materialists in some way. Most of them figure that we're just part of nature, and so we're entirely subject to the laws of nature. And if that is the case, then that means that our behavior, including the choices we make, is entirely determined by the laws of nature and our causal past. Usually people who think we have free choice of the libertarian kind are people like Augustine and Socrates and Plato, and although there's a problem of free will that's unique to Greek ethics, if for Socrates to know the good is to do the good, then how can somebody who knows how to do what's morally right have the free will to choose to do what's morally wrong if it's just a question of education? That's a problem of free will that we're not even going to touch on. But I mean, most people have been who have been defenders of free will from the libertarian perspective have thought that there's a part to us that's not just material, that's not totally subject to the laws of nature and to our causal history. Sartre's a little unique in being a libertarian and an atheist. Okay, let me pass around a roll so I don't forget. December 9th. Can't believe how quickly the time has been flying. I'll tell you what, I'm going to start it here, and then if you could walk it over, maybe we'll have people fill in the middle there. Okay. So unique causal past determines the unique future. And for the determinists, and so hard determinism holds this view, And hard determinism also holds that if our choices are entirely determined by the laws of nature, then that is not any kind of free will, and certainly not enough free will for moral responsibility. So hard determinists, and the two examples that we look at, Laplace and especially de Holbach. And again, you want to at least scan over de Holbach and remind yourself the main points. I don't have a PowerPoint on it, but we went over that reading. You know, they are incompatibilists, as I said. They hold that if we're that determined, then our being that determined is incompatible with the claim that we have enough free will for moral responsibility. Hence, somebody like de Holbach says, you know, we preach virtue to somebody in vain if their causal past determines them to make bad moral choices. It's not going to help to educate them on ethics. And hard determinism is basically the position that Clarence Darrow took when he was defending Leopold and Loeb, when he says that it's not these two young men who are really responsible for what they did in committing that murder, but the real responsibility lies in back of them in their causal past. He's saying that you know, it is their causal history, and especially their genetic and environmental past, that determines and has determined their choices. And I went into this a bit last time with the question regarding Leopold and Loeb. So, so for hard determinism, then, I mean, it's a pretty straightforward theory, right? Says everything you do is conditioned by your causal past. And as de Holbach says, there's a line drawn for you that you cannot swerve from for 1 minute, and that line is drawn by the laws of nature. So at any rate, for them, then, we are not free in any one moment. Now, what does a hard determinist like Laplace say about, you know, and I have an essay question on this, about this strong inner conviction we have that we're really making free choices. That when I deliberate between whether I want a cup of coffee at dinner, you know, or a happy hour beer, or, you know, or a Coke, that I can really make these choices. But hard determinism says it's your causal past that determines you to make the choice, and that given the same causal past, you will always make the same choice. So an important point about hard determinism is that all of our future choices are predictable in principle. Now, in other words, there's an argument for libertarianism that says, hey, I can genuinely deliberate about choices, and also, while you might know what the laws of nature are going to do to the coffee in this cup this afternoon if I leave it here, you don't know what I'm going to do this afternoon, and you don't know what I'm going to do this afternoon because I'm genuinely making free choices. For somebody like de Holbach, that point of view is based on an illusion of free choice. everything you do this afternoon has been determined by prior causes. The fact that you or I can't predict it simply means we don't have enough information. But all of your choices would be in principle predictable. And so that's the reason for this ugly guy, Laplace's demon. In other words, even though we don't have the information, a superhuman being like Laplace's demon does. He knows the position of all the atoms and molecules in the universe and all of the laws of the universe, and is such a good calculator that he can predict the future position of all of those atoms and molecules at any time in the future. And so even though I can't predict what you're going to do this afternoon, presumably Laplace's demon could. And this is what hard determinism holds, that in principle every choice you make has been determined by prior causes. Now, a lot of people don't like the consequence of, okay, you can set it there or bring it up at the end when it's less disruptive. A lot of people don't like the consequences for morality of hard determinism. They don't like the fact that people are saying, if everything in our causal past is determined, we don't have any moral responsibility, nor should we really be held legally responsible. This was Darrow's argument. You know, the real responsibility for what these two boys did, Leopold and Loeb, lies in back of them, in their causal history, not in the choices that they made. Those choices were determined entirely by their causal history, so we really shouldn't hold them at least so responsible for their actions that we would want to give them the death penalty. So there are other people who still believe we're basically material beings. And they hold that the laws of nature do determine us, but they say there's a way that we can still think of ourselves as having enough freedom of choice for moral responsibility. And here's where you get into the soft determinist position. They make a difference, a distinction, and you see this in the PowerPoint, between metaphysical freedom. In other words, if we had metaphysical freedom, and that is the kind of freedom that libertarians argue that we do have, freedom to go against the laws of nature in the physical world because we're more than just a physical being. But compatibilists would say, you know what, we do not have metaphysical freedom. They, along with the hard determinists, hold that a unique causal past determines a unique future. If we chose A, given the same causal past, we will always choose A, even though we thought we had a choice between A and B. So soft determinists are still determinists. It is false for the determinist, whether it's soft or hard, that given the same causal past, I could have chosen differently. For the determinist, I could not have chosen differently given the same causal past. What distinguishes libertarianism from both of these types of determinism is libertarians would say, given the same causal past, I could have chosen differently. If I chose to do A, given the same causal history, I had the freedom to choose to do B. That's what the libertarian claims, people like Sartre. That is not what soft or hard determinists claim. So soft determinism is still determinism. Another name for it is compatibilism. So they hold that are being determined by the laws of nature in our choices is still compatible with moral choice. Why? While they deny that we have metaphysical freedom, the freedom to go against the laws of nature, they nonetheless hold that we have moral freedom, and so they redefine what it is to make a choice freely. For soft determinists, and this is what TC means. TC stands for traditional compatibilism. Sorry, I made this up from a different text I used that also discussed a more complicated, more modern version of compatibilism that we don't need to worry about. All we discussed was traditional compatibilism. And traditional compatibilism says, I have moral freedom if the choices I make are motivated by some internal psychological state. In other words, if our choices are motivated by some internal psychological state of the agent, either by a belief, a want, a desire. If it was my belief or my want or my desire that maybe choose to do A, then they say, I had personal responsibility for doing and choosing A. And while I used to not care 2 cents for compatibilism, it really is pretty much the view of moral responsibility that is also held in the courts. In other words, if I ran into somebody's automobile because my car had a mechanical failure, we don't usually hold me, responsible. If I, the example I gave is if a bank robber has gets into your car and shoves a gun in your side and says, I want to get away from the police, drive as fast as you can and don't stop for anything. Well, we would normally not hold you responsible legally for running several red lights and driving 30 miles over the speed limit. You had very little choice. You were coerced into doing it. You had a gun in your side. So if I made my decisions freely, if I did what I desired to do, and I didn't desire to drive 30 miles over the speed limit and run red lights, then for them I made free choices for which I should be held morally responsible. In other words, if I decided I want to really open up, this motorcycle to see what it does with this new car, and I'm driving 85 on the expressway, then I made that choice. I did what I wanted to do, and they would hold I should be held legally and morally responsible for that. But as far as what then for compatibilists is an unfree action? Well, it's an action that I'm in some sense forced by external forces to make. Either the threat of physical force, right, like the bank robber with a gun, or it can be pressure, say, from your employer, if you're an accountant, to fudge the figures or else lose your job, right? So you can say, well, okay, somebody did something, but they were coerced to do it, And so the thing is, compatibilism is a little harder to understand, but that's how it determines. So it relates personal responsibility to freedom because it says we have moral freedom, and that's all we need for personal responsibility. So we had I'm not sure what they were saying was two conditions, but one of it is that you should be motivated. So the actions I'm responsible for, according to traditional compatibilism, are those actions that result from some internal psychological state of mind, not the ones I'm coerced. What under TC makes an action free and not forced? Again, that it's done by a psychological state, a belief, a desire, a want. Unfree actions for them are coerced actions. And it does mesh well with how we attribute someone's legal responsibility in a court of law. And forget the last thing there. That is a way of segueing into the other form of compatibilism, which we're not going to worry about. Again, the stuff on fatalism, I really discussed that in a lot of detail when I covered the questions. If you weren't here last time, I went through the question pool as a review with a fine-tooth comb. But existentialism and Sartre. Sartre is a libertarian. So remember, as I said before, this type of libertarianism is not political libertarianism. A political libertarian like Rand Paul or his father Ron Paul is basically a small government guy. There's somebody who holds with Jefferson that the government that governs best governs least. In other words, they want government out of our lives and want us to have the maximum amount of personal choice and liberty consistent with our not interfering with other people's free choice and liberty. This is not political libertarianism. Libertarianism basically says that given the same causal history, I could have chosen differently. Now, it gets criticized as being anti-Newtonian because most people who are libertarians, in one way or another, look upon us as more than just a physical being. I believe I circulated a roll, didn't I? Yeah, somewhere it's. Okay. So if you didn't sign it on the way out. Anyway, usually they're like Augustine or Plato and Socrates or Descartes or even Locke. They hold that we have free choice because we're more than just a physical being. There's a part of us that is not totally subject to the laws of nature. Now, Sartre is kind of unusual in that he's an atheist, so presumably he doesn't think that we have an immortal soul that's going to be with God once we die. But nonetheless, he is famous for having a libertarian position. And so we want to see how he gets to it. Basically, I'm not going to go through all the criticisms of atheism, of existentialism, but people were looking upon it as a very negative philosophy about human beings. He wants to emphasize the humanistic aspect of it because in this article, Existentialism as a Humanism, he tries to argue that basically we're free as human beings to make our own choices and even to choose what it means to be a human being, both as a species generally and in our own lives. How am I going to define what and who Vic Morawski is? How are you going to decide and define who you are. Well, the two kinds of existentialism, which we're not going to worry about much, are religious and atheistic existentialism. Religious existentialists basically are kind of liberal theologians. They're not traditional evangelical Christians or Orthodox Jews, but they would be Reformed Jews or liberal theologians who want to mix existentialism with Christian theology or Jewish, teachings. Sartre is not of that variety. He is an atheistic existentialist. He agrees with Nietzsche's claim that God is dead. Now, of course, what he means and what Nietzsche meant by that is not that the God of the Bible was once alive but passed away, but basically that we as sophisticated modern individuals don't need the concept of God anymore to help us cope with life and define who we are. That God isn't there, and so we ought to get over it. And so what he means God is dead is that we should think of God as being an irrelevant concept to today's life. So the belief that all existentialists share, though, is the belief that existence precedes essence. So what do we mean? We saw that Plato and Aristotle defined the essence of something in terms of the form it has. The essence of a triangle is that it's a plane geometric figure with 3 sides and 3 angles that add up to 180 degrees, okay? And so, and we saw Plato trying to get at the essence of a human being. And there's where we get the threefold soul. For Sartre, there's no pre-existing essence for a human being. How would there be a pre-existing essence? Well, he says, suppose God did exist. Then we would be a creation of God made according to God's predetermined plan. So God would define what it is to be a human being, just like is done with a manufactured object, like Sartre's paper knife, or like a coffee cup, or a cell phone, or a pair of glasses, right? We define what it is to be that object, and then afterwards, according to a pre-existing defined essence, we make the first paper knife or the first, cell phone or coffee cup or whatever. And so he says, if God were in the picture, our essence would precede our existence just as it does with manufactured things, and God would have a concept and define the concept of our essence. We wouldn't need to do it as human beings. But now Sartre says, but wait a minute, I'm an atheistic existentialist. I don't believe God is in the picture. So he says, there's no pre-existing human essence, no essential characteristics that define us as human beings. Here's where the humanism comes in. Protagoras' claim, man is the measure of all things, including what it is to be human. We define what it is to be human. A good illustration of this is what Richard Rorty once said in something I read. Rorty is a contemporary humanist, and he says, whether or not cyborgs, cybernetic organisms, right, from science fiction, are going to be considered human is not going to rest on our finding out something about the nature of human beings or the nature of cyborgs to see whether or not they qualify. But basically, what Rorty says is it's going to depend on our decision whether or not to let them into the club. We as human beings are going to define what it is to be human, and however we define that is going to either let cyborgs in or keep them out. And so this is what Sartre says. If there is no God, for human beings, existence precedes essence. The first principle of existentialism. We first exist, then we define what it is to be a human being. We determine human essence collectively as a species. We define what it is to be a human being, and individually for our own selves. Now, how do we do this? Well, we make projections in the future for ourselves, and then we make free choices to bring those projections to fruition. I hate it when it does that, because I'm not sure if it also goes out on the recording. It may not. So at any rate, in other words, suppose I came here and decided, well, I'm going to be a teacher. Well, there are certain courses you need to take in order to get qualified for that. Or I want to be in the nursing program, you know. And so you project who you want to be, and it's those future choices that determine your present decisions, not your causal past for Sartre. And Sartre gives an example of Constantine planning out the city of Constantinople. Some of you don't know this because you're not from this area, but Columbia, the city of Columbia, was a totally pre-planned city by the Rouse Company, the same company that built the mall down in the Inner Harbor. Totally pre-planned out. It was cow pasture at one time. And so, in other words, we projected in the future what that city would be, and we built it. So Sartre says it's not our causal past, it's not atoms and molecules banging around, it's not our genetic history, it's not our environmental history that determines our choices. We do. We're entirely free. This is why he says we're condemned to be free. Man is freedom for Sartre. And so we're free to define who we are going to be as an individual human being. But this is the basis of our responsibility. We're responsible for the choices we make, says Sartre. And this is not necessarily a source of joy for us. For Sartre, many of us don't want to accept the responsibility for taking charge of our own lives. We'd rather push it off to genetics or environment, or even push off our choices to a traditional morality in order to escape responsibility for them. For Sartre, this is to be in bad faith, mauvaise foi. So to be in bad faith is to relegate yourself as a human being to the level of inanimate things. Yeah, for Sartre, they are determined by the laws of nature, but we're not. And so we act in bad faith when we try to escape the responsibility for our decisions by pretending that we're determined. You know, so that's a reaction to our responsibility. Being in itself is the determined status of inanimate objects. Being for itself, for Sartre, is the existence status of human beings, the free status we have. So we've already defined determinism, what it is. Sartre obviously is not a determinist. He's a libertarian. He believes that given the same genetic history or the same environmental history, we could have chosen differently. We're not conditioned by our environment or our genetics. And in fact, he gets down on, say, gay people who say that they're determined by their causal past to be who they are. Sartre, now remember, this is he's writing in the 40s and 50s, but he says, he gives an example of a gay person who's in bad faith, not because he's gay. Sartre has no traditional morality, but is in bad faith because he claims his choices are already conditioned and they're not free. Okay. So this is what he means by saying we're condemned to be free. We're free whether we like it or not. We have personal responsibility for our choices. To try to pretend we're not free is to be in bad faith. We are condemned to be free. Well, some of the objections, you can object to Sartre, say things like, oh, wait a second, I don't have the freedom to choose to jump out the second floor window with nothing and have nothing happen to me, third floor window. I can't flap my arms and fly. I can't walk across North Avenue at rush hour and have cars bounce off of me or drink deadly poison. And Sartre, here I think Sartre gives the game away. He says, yeah, these are areas where our choices are limited. But Sartre says, I can choose not to walk across the street. I can choose not to drink the poison or not to, you know, jump out a second floor or third floor window. Yeah, but as I say, logically, he misses the point on this. But the point is, I can't do those things and not have them affect me because there are things about my human nature, my physical makeup as a human being, that I cannot remake just by trying to construct my essence. You know, we're not totally free in the way Sartre wants to pretend we are to determine who we are as a human being. Okay. So anyway, Mill and utilitarianism was what we did last. So basically, the original plan was to try to get both classes' papers back.